coming up in November, there's a parole hearing. Do you have a role in that?
Traditionally, as solicitor, I kind of had a standard letter. And of course, Kevin Brackett is the solicitor now. He was my deputy solicitor and was with me back at that time. But traditionally, I've sent a letter that in the simplest term just says, I believe in truth in sentencing. And if the jury gave what they believed to be a life sentence, they weren't able to be informed that parole eligibility was a part of it, then I think that's the sentence that should be delivered. Of course, in this case, I was seeking the death penalty, and the jury chose life. So I really always try not to dispute the jury's verdict, but I also want to make sure that the parole board doesn't undermine the jury's verdict either.
Right. Is there a lot to consider in this? In that, when jurors said life in prison, they thought that that's what she would get, not necessarily parole after 30 years.
Sure. So what happened is, we tried the case. It happened in 94. We tried it in 95. In 1996, the legislature actually changed and life began to actually mean life. Unfortunately, back then, not only did life not mean life, you could not tell the jury that, because as I recall, 30 years ago, they came back with, questions of would she be eligible for parole. And the law at that time required the judge to basically say, you as a juror to take life in its plain and usual meaning. Life and death mean life and death. And that way it keeps the jurors arguably from diving down into forms of execution, all the things, will it be carried out, will it not? In other words, it tries to save the jury from speculating. But I can remember after the case, some jurors saying they really believed that her, having to be in jail the rest of her life, thinking about what she did to kids and being remorseful basically would be the greatest punishment. If all those factors were true, that may well be accurate, but I think we've seen from her behavior that she's focused a little more on Susan than she is on what happened to Michael and Alex.
She has not been the model prisoner.
Right. She's not been she hadn't jumped over the fence or escaped or assaulted a guard. Again, I think as you see her behavior over the years, it's reflective of who she is, who she was, and Susan comes first. I mean, whether it's and she's always kind of used her sexuality to get what she wanted, whether it was all the relationships with Tom Finley and the stepfather and all those things, or the relationships with the guards, or the pen pal now, or the sugar daddies that are willing to help her when she gets out. I mean, for whatever reason, and there's got to be mental health issues here. There anybody that would do the things we see in the courtroom, there's got to be something, a backstory to it. But the bottom line is she is always looking out for what's best for Susan, and I don't think that's changed while she's been in prison.
I imagine you got to know Susan Smith from your side of things fairly well. Who is Susan Smith?
I think, and it's ironic, I remember, there was the first question of whether we were even going to seek the death penalty. And I always say, I give the defense credit, David Bruck and Judy Clark. Their goal is always to prevent somebody from getting the death penalty. I mean, in simplest terms, much past that, they don't care. And to their credit, they went from Susan the monster in January to Susan the victim in July. And, we see it a lot more now than we did back then with social media and things, but basically changing the public's perception. I always told people, I really am not the yin to their yang. In other words, I'm not a bloodthirsty prosecutor who says, I can't wait to see, someone executed or get someone executed. I always treated that part of my job as just that, a job, much like a soldier. There are soldiers who would do their job that would take a life in protection of this country, but not necessarily a zealot for it. So I'm getting a little off track here, but the gist of it was they wanted me to speak to Susan, and I really had no interest in speaking to Susan. I needed to focus on, my job. And one part of my job I always thought was in seeking justice, if the black man with the toboggan who she accused had actually committed the crime, I would be lucky that that I got to get it to trial before somebody stormed the jail, almost the lynching situation. If David Smith, the father, had done it, I think it'd be similar, hue and cry for the death penalty. I just felt strongly that Susan should be treated the same. We shouldn't treat her different, as awkward as it was, because you say, who was Susan Smith? Susan Smith could be your coworker, your little sister, your daughter. She had a different feel than our traditional defendants. And I think that's what made it awkward for the public and awkward for jurors even, in that we don't want to think. It's almost more comforting that somebody carjacks you at the stoplight, because we can protect against that, arguably. But every day I left to go to work, my wife was raising my kids, and I had full faith that my kids were safe with my wife. When we start tapping on some of those foundational beliefs that we all have, I think it's disconcerting. And so I think Susan Smith is really two things. One, she's the girl next door, the girl at the grocery store, your friend, your coworker. But then inside there is that whatever brought her to this point is an extremely self-indulgent, selfish individual that rightfully or wrongfully focused on what was best for her. And that meant even to the exclusion of Michael and Alex.